Rennie. Okay. Good morning. Good morning, and thank you again for being here. I appreciate you coming out. As always, it really means a lot and helps to have some embodied presence here together, which I'll actually talk a little about the importance of that today. I guess I'll start off by making a confession, which is that the intention of this lecture series is pretty audacious. And I'm really, I feel like we're endeavoring here to really try to understand some of the deepest problems that we're facing as a species, as a civilization. And this lecture today will be a sort of culmination of this whole series. So if you've been following along, hopefully that will be meaningful to you and it'll make sense. If you haven't heard the first three lectures, it may be a different experience than if you had, but hopefully it'll still be meaningful. So just to recap a little bit, in the first talk, we looked at polarization, and we looked at it in the context of the evolution of consciousness, and really just trying to get a sense of what is this historical unfolding that we're a part of, and how can we understand some of the things that are happening now and some of the problems that we're facing now in that sort of evolutionary context. The second talk looked at mental health and really where we're at in that evolution of consciousness right now and the stage of civilization we're at right now and the stage of the evolution of technology that we're at right now is really having a big impact on our mental and emotional lives. And then in the last talk, we went sort of deeper into the tech aspect of that and looked at AI and really the implications of artificial intelligence and what that really says and reflects about us and our thinking and our consciousness. And the underlying impulse underneath these lectures is that you have to understand the sickness if you're going to find the medicine, right? And the punchline here, which I can go ahead and give away, is that Waldorf education is a kind of medicine. But we will appreciate that and understand that the better we understand the sickness, right? Steiner actually said, "Do not begin by asking, what must I do, what must others do? The important question is, how do I gain insight into the present situation? When one has adequate insight, one will follow the right course," right? So that's the underlying premise here. And part of what I've come to and what I'm trying to convey is that understanding this moment in time, understanding the sickness that we're sort of experiencing collectively, has to do with the overarching story that we have for history, right? We're sort of in an evolutionary story where many characters seem to have lost the plot line. We sort of are forgetting that we have the ability to have a coherent overarching story to make sense of things. And there's a way in which we can understand that loss of coherent story as part of a bigger story, right? So that's also part of what's trying to be unfolded here. And in this sort of modern moment that we're in, this sense of relativism and a loss of shared truth and a loss of shared story and materialism, these are some of the things that we have to grapple with and understand if we're going to really understand what kind of medicine we need. And a key point here that I'll keep coming back to is that attention and how we use our attention is really key to knowing how to take the medicine that we need. So in this last lecture, we're going to look even more closely and more in depth at this sort of modern materialist worldview that is dominating our planet right now. We're going to try to understand how it creates and exacerbates our biggest problems, and then we'll be able to understand how education can help us heal ourselves. And we're going to look at the brain to help us understand key aspects of our experience and also a way of understanding why Waldorf education in particular can be an exemplar for us to help us grow in the right direction. And the way I was thinking of it the past few days is realizing it's sort of a hero's journey that we're unfolding too, right? There's sort of there is a challenge that we're facing collectively, but there is a sort of redemptive arc to the story, I think, if we look at it in just the right way. So that said, I want to actually pick up a little bit where I left off and talk a little bit more about AI, because there were some things that I didn't get around to saying. We talked about how problems related to AI are really reflections of ourselves, and it's really a way of us understanding ourselves and understanding humanity. It's not really just about understanding the technology. And we looked at understanding the limits of data computation and the limits and the mind and the worldview that's creating AI. But the thing I didn't really get to talk about, which I'd like to say a little bit more now, the worldview of the people who are most responsible for pushing the AI agenda. And I think we need to take a closer look at that, because one of the interesting things about technological evolution right now is that it's not happening completely unconsciously and by accident. For instance, like climate change, global warming, all the problems we're facing in terms of our relationship to the environment, it's an interesting contrast in that there aren't many people, if anyone, explicitly saying, let's destroy the environment, right? It's actually just an unconscious output of our collective behavior, and we haven't figured out how to become conscious enough to actually stop it. But that's different than people actively trying to destroy the environment. But with AI, there's actually a particular worldview that really believes that consciousness is reducible to computation and that carbon-based life forms can and maybe even should be replaced by silicon-based intelligence. So the idea that that AI would potentially kill all of humans and life is actually, for some worldviews, not actually a bad thing. So people like Nick Land, Nick Bostrom, Ray Kurzweil, Elon Musk, Sam Altman, Eliezer Yudkowsky, Mark Andreessen, Larry Page, many of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the technology space actually share a worldview which is known as TESCREAL, T-E-S-C-R-E-A-L. And what this really comes down to is a belief in transhumanism, a belief in singularity utopianism, meaning they think that there's some technological omega point that's going to just radically change everything and might be the end of humanity. They have a long-termism as a part of it, means thinking in radically long-term frames, so that, for instance, they put forward the argument that it's, AI could potentially save millions of lives or do good things in the future, therefore it's morally wrong to stop it now, right? And totally losing perspective of impacts now, really thinking all about the distant future. And this leads to a kind of accelerationism, right? Because when you have a belief in transhumanism, meaning you think that the trajectory of evolution is going beyond the human, and you're also caught up in economic multipolar traps, which is something we talked about last time, that leads to a kind of accelerationism, right? So there's this materialist, post-human worldview that reduces human experience to computation and data, thinks that there's no meaningful difference between carbon-based life forms and silicon-based computer chips, and sort of sees it almost as inevitable. For some of them, it's very deterministic, that this is just gonna happen. So it justifies not being very careful, it justifies not really thinking very deeply about the implications, and it justifies accelerating the whole process. So we have to sort of understand this mind that is operating with a lot of power right now if we're going to have any meaningful resistance to it, I think. And by looking closer at the brain, I hope we can actually get a deeper understanding of that worldview. One other thing I'll note about this worldview is it's actually very religious in an interesting way. Greg Epstein wrote a book called Tech Agnostic, and also has been on some podcasts where he's talking about the tech God complex. And there are many influential people who are adopting a story about AI that, according to Greg Epstein, it's so big it makes religions of antiquity seem small by comparison, right? They talk about AI in very extreme language. They describe AI as a god very explicitly, some of them do. And it really is, if you look at it, it's sort of bad theology and bad metaphysics, but disguised as a kind of scientific futurism, right? So it's a worldview that doesn't think of itself as religious, but if you actually look at the kind of claims they're making and the implications, we can see it's sort of a new, very strange sort of technological, reductionistic, materialistic, religious mentality. So we have to be able to sort of understand what we're working with. If you look at somebody like Sam Altman, for instance, he's actually said things like, oh, well, AI will probably kill us all, but it will make us a lot of money first. Elon Musk is also on record saying that, well, it's going to be better to be alive during the end of humanity than to miss it, so might as well accelerate it and make it happen so that I can see it. Which is, just two examples of how completely divorced from what most sane people would think is sanity. So that's just something to, we could talk more about, but just to name that, there is a dominant worldview that is I think, actually insane, and we need to understand why. Another thing that I didn't really get a chance to talk about last time is this notion of techno-feudalism. I mentioned there's going to be some books coming out that aren't published yet that really look at this notion of techno-feudalism. And the thing to understand there is that it's really part of this worldview is sort of like a Skinnerian, like B.F. Skinner worldview, where there's now this possibility for totalized control of our environment that's enabled by digital technologies, where people can be nudged and influenced in particular ways. And another big part of this worldview is that the only way to survive, so a way to flip it as a positive thing from this point of view, is that the only way that we can actually solve problems is by controlling people, right? Because history shows that people just basically don't know how to get along, don't know how to solve problems. And there's this belief, and B.F. Skinner believed this very clearly and explicitly, that politics would be replaced by a science of human behavior, which allows benevolent technocratic conditioners to gently nudge the masses towards safety and sanity. And this is a big part of what's driving tech leaders as well. For instance, Alex Pentland, who's the founder of the MIT Media Lab, wrote a book called The Social Self, which is what he describes as social physics. And the worldview that's animating MIT and the Media Lab is it's completely Skinnerian. It's based on this idea of social physics, where we actually have to control people's behavior, and there's nothing morally wrong with that because they live in a materialist deterministic world anyway. So actually free will is an illusion. So there's a lot of contradictions baked into their worldview, but the worldview is basically free will is an illusion. Experience can be reduced to computation. We actually have to create environments that control and manipulate people's behavior in order to have any sense of what should happen, right? So our question is, how did we get here, right? How did we get to that point, and how do we get out of this Skinner box, right? One of the basic metaphor that techno-feudalism is working with is seeing how the digitally mediated planet right now is becoming something like a big Skinner box, right? A Skinner box is an environmentally closed sort of conditional environment where all the actors in that environment are conditioned and controlled. So how did we get here? How do we get out of it? What have we lost, and what do we have to do to regain it, right? Those are my questions. And I think understanding our brains and the limits and parameters and conditions of our experience through our bodies actually can give us some insight here. So let's talk about the brain. And before I get into the brain, a few disclaimers about what I am and am not saying. So one of the dangers of talking about the brain is it can fall into a kind of materialism, right, where you can reduce human experience to the brain. And that's explicitly not what I'm doing. The brain does not originate experience, right? It does not explain what experience is, but it can illuminate the constraints that we have on how we experience reality. You can think of it almost like the banks of a river, right? The banks of a river constrain the river, but it doesn't create the river. Brain studies cannot ever actually clarify whether or not the brain emits, transmits, or permits consciousness, right? The relationship between consciousness and the brain cannot be explained by the brain or by brain studies. The person I'm most following in this work is Ian McGilchrist. Actually, the impetus for this talk initially was just a thought I had months ago of just like, I have to give a talk about Ian McGilchrist's work. It's so significant. And McGilchrist's point of view is that the most coherent understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the brain is that the brain probably does something like permit consciousness, right? So there's a way in which consciousness is, and the brain permits our experience of it. It doesn't create it. And even more broadly, it's important to just say that, reductionism in general is pretty much always a mistake, right? Nothing can ever be reduced to something else. As Wittgenstein said, everything is what it is and not another thing, right? You can't ever reduce something to something else. Brain processes facilitate perception. Perception is not a brain process. We need brains to perceive, but perception isn't inside our brains. We're not reducible to our brains. The brain is an organ of perception and not the perceiver. Okay, so that said, let's talk about the brain. One thing to understand, too, sort of overarching, is the significance of attention. and how attention is not just a cognitive function. Attention is how the world comes into being for us, right? Consciousness is the horizon of our whole experience. And things do change according to how we attend to them. And the hemispheres enable and constrain attention in particular ways. And many people and cultures throughout history have distinguished sort of two fundamentally different orientations to reality and to thought and relationships, right? There's this distinction between intellect and intuition, which is one way of thinking about it as intellect is more of a left hemisphere orientation. Intuition is more of a right hemisphere. Rationality versus reason, like the Greeks talked about logic versus phronesis. There's different ways that we can relate to the world. And the bihemispheric brain makes it possible to attend to the world simultaneously in two otherwise incompatible ways. And again, on a very deep level, this reflects the world that we live in, right? We live in a world of polarity. We live in a world of wholes and parts. And we can expect our nervous system to reflect this sort of universal structure. Unity and duality, polarity, yin and yang, Apollo and Dionysus, right? We live in a world of asymmetrical, symmetrical polarity, right, depending on the case. And every creature's nervous system is asymmetrical. So every brain has a bipartite structure. And the bigger the brain, the less interconnected it is. So in the human brain, we actually have two very autonomous systems. The more that the brain has evolved, the more the hemispheres have become separated over time. And we can understand this in evolutionary terms in terms of the basic needs of embodied beings, right? There is a need for focused attention, and there's also a need for open attention. And the purpose of the corpus callosum is to separate the hemispheres. So we can see in children, there's less hemispheric independence. In pre-adolescent children, it's actually difficult for them to use the hemispheres independently. So both evolutionarily, the hemispheres become more separate over time, and in the lifespan of each person, the hemispheres become more separate over time. The right hemisphere is continually sustaining coherence and actively scanning the world and the environment. It's open, it's without preconception, it attends to the environment and relationships. This is the attention of prey, right? Prey have to be aware of their environment and very sensitive to their reality. The left hemisphere is narrow beam and focused, right? Is the attention of the predator. And it enables us to manipulate and have some degree of control over the world. So each perspective is internally consistent but mutually inconsistent. And many apparent logical paradoxes arise from the sort of left hemisphere attempt to understand something that actually has to be understood as a whole by the right hemisphere. I'll also say that one of the problems with thinking about the hemispheric brain is there's a lot of bad research out there. There's a lot of actually misconception about the hemispheres. And some of the, McGilchrist is really at pains to demonstrate this, that he's sort of fighting a battle against many years of really bad research and misconceptions that have led to people thinking that the importance of the hemispheres is sort of overblown, and when in reality it's just not very well understood. And the reason largely is because the issue isn't in what the hemispheres do, it's in how they do it, right? So like one misconception out there is this separation between the rational and the emotional, right? As though the left hemisphere is rational and the right hemisphere is, and that's just completely false. Reason and emotion are actually never separate, but it's this distinction really between open and focused and direct experience of reality versus being in relationship with an internal representation of reality. Another important thing to understand about the brain is the relationship between the hemispheres is dialectical, meaning the right hemisphere initially grounds us in our experience. We have connection to the world through our right hemisphere. The left hemisphere then can clarify and unpack sort of aspects of that experience, and then the right hemisphere sort of reintegrates that. So there's this balance between right and then left and then right, and that's how we sort of integrate our experience. That's a well-functioning, well-integrated brain. So the left hemisphere works ideally as a sort of intermediate stage. It's the emissary. One of McGilchrist's books is called The Master and His Emissary. The underlying argument is the right hemisphere has to be the master. The left hemisphere is the servant or the emissary that actually should be working in collaboration with and in service of the holistic perception of the right hemisphere. And a cool thing to think about for me is that our awareness of how dialectics work is, in a sense, an attempt of the mind's, it's an attempt to express the mind's intuition of its own structure, right? Like when we see how dialectics work, that's also how our own mind and brain work. So we're attending to the world always in these two very different ways. We experience the live, the complex, the embodied world of unique wholes and relationships, and we also experience representations of that. Static, bounded, fragmented, grouped, isolated, mechanical, fixed, inert, lifeless. Those are the ways that the left hemisphere perceives. So it's not different ways of just thinking about the world, it's different ways of actually experiencing the world. And the kind of serial processing that the left hemisphere does is separated from the right hemisphere because those processes would impair the right hemisphere's ability to be in touch with reality. But as a result of that, the holistic approach of the right hemisphere is not actually available to the language and conceptual thought of the left hemisphere. So we can experience the world directly, but we can't ever actually fully articulate it, right? There's a fundamental separation. Also, it's the case that new experience is always processed through the right hemisphere, and as it becomes familiar, it actually becomes represented by the left hemisphere. So the conceptual mind always knows really only what it's representing to itself through the left hemisphere, not what is present as a whole. Carl Jung said, all cognition is akin to recognition. And this is actually what he meant. When we're cognizing something, we're actually in relationship to a sort of representational recognition of it in our own experience, which is different than the direct unmediated experience that we can only have in a sort of transverbal way through our right hemisphere. So one of the things that McGilchrist did, and why his work is significant, is because he went through just tons of research around split brain patients, people who have had damage to one of their hemispheres. So there's lots of data on people who literally only have access to one of their hemispheres. And you can see really clear and distinct patterns. So a lot of the things that I'm going to say, I'm going to keep sharing a little bit more about the characteristics of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. What I'm referring to is a lot of research that's really looking at people who either have very clear clinical damage to one of their hemispheres, or they're like a split brain patient who only has access to one or the other. So the left hemisphere worldview, and as I'm describing the left hemisphere worldview, we can think about the AI tech worldview, and maybe there's some similarities. The left hemisphere worldview is confident, it's black and white, it jumps to conclusions, it sees linear relationships. For the left hemisphere, it doesn't attend to it does not attend to what ceases to exist in its own experience. For instance, when someone who's using their right hemisphere sees a partial figure, they can see the implied whole, like they can understand what's not there. For it, the hidden part still exists. But in a left hemisphere view, if you have someone who doesn't have access to the right hemisphere, if they see only a fragment, they can't see the implied whole. They literally just can't. There is no implied whole. It just is what it is. When you have right hemisphere damage, you disown problems. In the research, there's really humorous and crazy examples of the extreme extent that people go to when they don't have access to the right hemisphere, of how they fail to take responsibility for things. They're always in the right and can never be wrong. There's no ownership ever that they ever did anything wrong. It's always a projection onto the other person. And it's also a helpful way to understand schizophrenia, that the right frontal lobe is actually underactive in schizophrenia, and one of the aspects of that is always projecting responsibility for your own thoughts and actions onto other things. The left hemisphere practices confabulation. It will just make up stories to explain its own worldview and its own perception. It will believe its own story regardless of any evidence against it. It prizes consistency, right? Because the left hemisphere is building a model of the world, and it's in relationship to that model. It's not in relationship to the real world. And protecting and explaining everything in terms of its own internal model is everything for it. It can't get out. It's stuck in its own self-enclosed representational pseudo-reality. That's the limits of the function of the left hemisphere. Its job is to build a model and maintain it at all costs. It adopts a theory and denies anything that does not fit with that theory. When there are rules and procedures to follow, the left hemisphere is in its element. Without rules and procedures, it's completely lost. It ignores, denies, and dismisses anything it can't pin down and measure. There's no depth of space or time or emotion. It will literally suppress sensory information that conflicts with its own ideas. So in one sense, the left hemisphere is only in touch with a map of reality, whereas the right hemisphere enables us to actually be in touch with reality. So the right hemisphere is, in some ways, it's our bullshit detector, right? We need access to the right hemisphere to be able to check our models of the world against reality. The right hemisphere sees the whole. It sees context. It's relational. It's open. The right hemisphere has to be the primary way in which we're making sense of the world. Otherwise, we're going to be deeply confused. And there's also an asymmetry between how they relate to each other. So the right hemisphere is able to understand the input from the left hemisphere, but not vice versa. The left hemisphere just cannot understand what the right hemisphere is perceiving. And similarly, we can think about how a sort of mechanistic worldview can come from experience. Experience can never come from a mechanistic worldview, right? So there's so many different kinds of asymmetry between different ways of experiencing the world that can be illuminated by the asymmetry between the hemispheres. The right hemisphere sees things as alive. So one thing that's really interesting, if someone doesn't have access to their left hemisphere, you're living in a world of animism, right? Like you can sense that there's a sort of aliveness and consciousness to everything, whereas the left hemisphere is the opposite. Even people and plants and animals, when perceived only by the left hemisphere, seem like robots. They seem dead. They seem lifeless. They seem inert. There's just no fundamental understanding of life when you're trapped in a left hemisphere view. The right hemisphere is embedded in the world. The left hemisphere is abstracted from the world. It's the difference between being present in the world and representing the world. So basically, the left hemisphere is unreliable in pretty much every way that matters. It cannot be trusted to understand the real world because it literally can't understand the real world. But it doesn't have to, right? That's why we have two hemispheres. It's all about being in right relationship to each other. The problem is when the emissary tries to become the master. We can also see a way in which the left hemisphere drives a will to power. So a lot of the behavioral tendencies we see in society, there's often a drive to sort of make everything equal in general. So another aspect of the left hemisphere is a loss of uniqueness, a loss of the qualitative individuality of things, and losing that in a sense of categorization and generalizations. And with that often comes a drive to just sort of level everything and make everything the same. Nietzsche actually said the will to equality is the will to power. And there was actually a deep insight there in terms of when we flatten everything and see everything as equal, we become more oriented toward actually having control and power. And we can justify that because there's a loss of uniqueness and individuality and therefore intrinsic value in individual things. And when the left hemisphere is in power of thinking and understanding, it also tends toward basically the end point is a virtual world, right? So a quote from McGilchrist. The more focal attention is narrowed, the more it takes its object out of the realm of time, space, the body, and emotion. A virtual world is merely the conclusion of that process. And that is where the evolution of the left hemisphere leads, to a virtual world. It's also important for our understanding of morality and ethics. Moral decision-making requires the right hemisphere for perceiving intention and context. The performative repetition of cliches, or the notion of following a script, is not morality, but it is the left hemisphere approach to what's right and wrong. The left hemisphere is more utilitarian, and you can see a lot of utilitarian arguments for AI coming up in the people who are really pushing for AI development. But there's also a ton of research on how utilitarian worldviews are associated with antisocial and self-centered traits, right? Because you can justify pretty much any means, right? Ends justify the means when you have a utilitarian worldview. Moral judgments based on intuition include everything we've ever experienced, whereas utilitarian calculus acts as if context is limited only to what is explicitly included in their model by which they're making their utilitarian calculations. So you can see the difference between an intuitive moral sensibility where you are in touch with the intrinsic value of individual things versus a utilitarian model that actually limits the scope of decision making just to what is included within the model. It's also two very different views on purpose, right? Extrinsic purpose versus intrinsic purpose. If you have a sense of extrinsic purpose, it's more deterministic, it's narrowly focused. Intrinsic purpose and the understanding of that depends upon connection to reality through the right hemisphere. So in sum of this distinction, another quote from McGilchrist. The world of the left hemisphere, dependent on language and abstraction, yields clarity and power to manipulate things that are known, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized, explicit, disembodied, and ultimately lifeless. The right hemisphere, by contrast, yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate, living beings within the context of the lived world. And to this world, it exists in a relationship of care. So it's a big and important distinction, I think, and it has a lot of implications for the different kinds of orientations we can see in which people are living their lives. So part of McGilchrist's argument, which is why this is important, is because the argument is that as a society, we are becoming more like people with right hemisphere deficits. The patterns are actually pretty clear. And since the Industrial Revolution, we've created a world that reflects the orientation of the left hemisphere. Part of this, too, is like as the world is changing through globalization and mobility and a sort of loss of a deep connection of cultures through which a lot is transmitted implicitly, we've sort of lost a lot of sort of implicit sense-making in relation to each other, and we're moving more toward having to make things more and more explicit and having a loss of that sort of embodied right hemisphere dependent connection to each other. So the brain and culture are a part of this bigger story. It's not an argument that the brain drives culture or culture changes the brain development, but these are two aspects, again, of this larger unfolding that's happening. We can look at the evolution and changes of culture, we can look at some aspects of modernity, and we can look at the brain all as parts of this bigger story that I'm trying to tell. So that sort of begs the question, like, how would we re-understand history in this light? So I'm going to kind of take us a walk through history through this lens of the left and right hemisphere. And in addition to McGilchrist, I'm also drawing on Owen Barfield here, who's a very just interesting thinker who I'll be returning to. But basically, the argument is that the pre-modern world was not left hemisphere dominant, and our modern world has become more left hemisphere dominant. Barfield has this idea of original participation. So he explains original participation as the basic default orientation that human beings had prior to modernity, right? Where there's an extrasensory relation between humans and phenomena, and he sort of traces a history of how this survived into the Middle Ages and then fundamentally shifted. So some quotes from Barfield. Participation is a way of experiencing the world in immediacy, not a system of ideas about experience or about the world. Before the scientific revolution, the world was more like a garment people wore about them than a stage on which they moved. They felt themselves in the objects around them, and the words that expressed those objects immersed together in something like a clear lake of meaning. Right? So for Barfield, the evolution of consciousness is actually, in some ways up until now, the progressive decline in original participation. We've sort of lost this participatory aspect, which was mediated through the right hemisphere, and we've somehow lost connection with that, which may be associated with a sort of shift that's happened in how we're experiencing reality through our brains. He describes it as moving from a vague but immediate awareness of the meaning of phenomena towards an increasing preoccupation with the phenomena themselves. Right? An interesting description of the modern world. We can also look through history how music and singing came before language. It's part of what bounded people together, made us aware of our shared feelings and shared experiences. We can look at the evolution from song and poetry into language and prose as a move toward the left hemisphere. In ancient languages like ancient Hebrew and Greek, there is no word for thing. The emergence of things and proper nouns is something that happened over time. In McGilchrist's 2-volume most recent work, the title of the book is The Matter with Things, right? And the overarching idea is when we think of reality in terms of discrete things, we're already actually trapped into a left hemisphere orientation to the world. For the right hemisphere, there are no distinct and discrete things. And that is reflected in how language changed over time. So over time, the world of process becomes a world of things for people. In Greek grammar, you can see this evolution, the emergence of the definitive article the turned adjectives into nouns. In Nietzsche's study of Greek culture, you can see this tension reflected in the Apollonian and the Dionysian, right? The sort of rational and the intuitive. And what Nietzsche's pointing to is this moment in time when this shift is happening, right? Where we're maybe going from a right hemisphere dominant original participation into a more left hemisphere dominant sort of what Barfield calls alpha thinking. But there may have been moments in time throughout history and still presently when there is relative balance between the hemispheres, and you can see a flourishing in the arts and the sciences and in literature and in culture that reflect a sort of well-integrated culture. But what's happened is basically the Apollonian has triumphed at the expense of the Dionysian, is another way of looking at history. Julian Jaynes' work on the breakdown of the bicameral mind is really interesting because he tracks a lot of the same data and uses a lot of really interesting examples of changes over history, but it seems like he got the reason backwards. His argument is that actually the mind was more separated, and it's the breakdown of the separated mind that created the shift, but I think more recent research has showed that he got the basic argument right, he just got the brain wrong. It was actually the increasing separation of the hemispheres that led to the shift where phenomena that were previously unified became foreign, and there became more of a sort of separation between the experiencer and the experience as the brain became more hemispheric, not less hemispheric. We can see in sort of, again, pre-modern examples like Thales and Heraclitus, where all things are full of gods, whereas when by the time we get to sort of Parmenides and Plato, we start to see this bifurcation happen, right? And Plato is really a turning point in civilization in creating this real clear distinction between sort of two different kinds of reality. And one way of thinking about that is just, again, the human mind is in this process of evolution and trying to understand its experience and sort of making these fundamental distinctions that are maybe in some ways becoming experienced by people in ways that were not previously experienced. So as early thinkers were trying to make sense of their own minds and experience, they were laying out different sorts of orientations, right? So in the world of Plato and Aristotle, they actually saw and argued really clearly that logic must be constrained by a spiritual pursuit of truth. There was this sense that this very limited sort of logical way of thinking had to be constrained by a search for spiritual truth, by what they called phronesis, right? They had to be in right relationship. And that logic divorced from truth would no longer be a good thing. This is like fundamental to the ancient worldview. But the past 2,000 or 3,000 years have been a sort of gradual ousting of participation by logical alpha thinking and thinking about representations as though they're independent of us. So that's sort of one way of thinking about what has changed. By the time we get to people like Descartes and William of Ockham and Francis Bacon and Hobbes, we see a very materialist, very hyper-rational logic divorced from a deeper search from truth, logic divorced from the sense that we can even know reality. The sense of sort of nominalism starts to spread, where nature is simply like mechanism. Ideas are merely a product of human thought. Nature is basically not intelligible. There becomes this thought which is developed in a really intricate way by Kant, where there's this fundamental separation, and we can never understand reality. That's the left hemisphere unable to see that we actually have access to a right hemisphere direct connection to reality. So there's so many examples, if you look at modern thought, of how you see this shift happens, where we're no longer experiencing ourselves as in touch with reality. And logic sort of begins to function as a self-enclosed feedback loop. Another thing is that as we start to see nature as more a mechanism, which is how the left hemisphere would see the world, we also start to think of ourselves more as mechanism. And we start to think of the brain as more like a computer. And we start to have ideas of the modern computer. And when we think that the world is like a machine, we feel like we will have a better experience of it, or a more true or accurate experience of it, the more that we become like a machine. And we start to reimagine the human and the world in the image of machines. And this is what has happened. It's very prevalent, and it is a pretty clearly left hemisphere dominant view. It's also important to see traces throughout history where balance and integration and health have arisen as sort of possibilities for us. And I think one way of thinking about the Renaissance and Romanticism are as glimmers of attempts at right hemisphere integration, but the sort of left hemisphere dominance of the Enlightenment did eventually take over and lead to the Industrial Revolution and a sort of mechanization and materialization of human life. But there's always been glimmers of people and subcultures who are actually trying to find balance and trying to push against those sort of materialistic forces, right? So if you look at Shakespeare, there's great examples of disregard for theory and categories, celebration of multiplicity and individuality. You can see in Pascal, right, the heart has reasons of which reason knows nothing. Luther and the Protestant Reformation is an interesting phenomenon in this light because it was actually initially about grounding religion in experience. But what actually happened was it ended up sort of unleashing left hemisphere dominant forces to basically try to eradicate religion, and a total loss of metaphorical understanding, right? So what happened through the Reformation is a sort of, when you're looking at a statue, it's this either or, like the statue's either God, which is like a crazy sort of animism, or it's nothing. It's just concrete, right? It's just wood. There's a total loss of metaphor and participation and a sense of just different ways of relating to what language can disclose to us about reality and our relationship to divinity, right? There's just a loss of that. There's a disenchantment of the world. There's the death of God, the secularization, right? There's a real loss that happens here. But what poets and different people throughout history have been trying to do is to help us find ways to reintegrate and rebalance, right? And to put this in Barfield's terms, I think it is helpful. You sort of see this move from original participation to a loss of it, but then there is a redemptive possibility for Barfield in what he calls final participation. So as we move toward that, let me say a little bit more before we get to final participation. Thinking about the Industrial Revolution, and once we really start to get into the modern worldview, the left hemisphere dominant worldview, one thing that happens is that people literally start to go crazy. And the emergence of madness, the emergence of schizophrenia, the emergence of insane asylums, these things did not exist prior to the modern world, right? I don't know how accurate this data is, but one number I saw that basically in Britain in 1700, there were like 100, patients in like insane asylums. By 1800, the number was 10,000. By 1900, the number was 100,000. At this point, there's way more than 100,000 people who are in the sort of care of needing mental health and having mental health concerns. As G.K. Chesterton said, the madman is not the one who has lost his reason. The madman is the one who has lost everything except his reason, right? Because what he's lost is his right hemisphere connection to the real world. And the emergence of modern madness is what happens to people when they're disconnected from the reality of their embodied experience of the world, which they need both sides of their brain to mediate. Louis Sass wrote a book called Madness and Modernism, which really traces the parallels between modernism as a cultural movement and madness as a psychological pathology. And just, a couple examples of this just to highlight, how far we've gone. Many people may be familiar with the fact that René Descartes and others at that time used to operate on animals and dogs, just thinking that they're basically machines. They literally thought of all life other than humans as like machines. No pain possible, no emotion possible. So the forms of brutalism that took place between humans and animals in this logic of materialism and mechanization is just crazy. And maybe even crazier than that, something I just found out in my recent research, doctors throughout the Western world have operated on infants without anesthetics because the thought was, because they can't verbalize their pain, they're not experiencing pain. And this idea was promoted in influential articles through the 1940s. It wasn't until 1987 that the AAP changed course and actually made it so that we use anesthetics on infants. That's how divorced from just basic embodied reality we are, to not think that the experience of a crying infant is meaningful, to think, oh, well, you're just so separated from reality at that point, I almost don't just know what to say. But it's true. It's true. So we have to come to terms with it. So the point here is that thinking of nature as a machine and the brain as a machine and the types of behavior that come out of that, it's a form of madness. And that when we're listening to very wealthy and powerful and supposedly smart people talk to us about technology and computers and the future, if their worldview is rooted in these kinds of materialism and mechanization and the reduction of what it means to be a human, we have to be able to see that they're crazy. And they're actually not the ones we should be listening to. They're not bringing wisdom to our culture. They're just not. They're actually still in the very same worldview that William of Ockham and Descartes and Hobbes and others had. It's a very prevalent worldview. It's very clear. It's not new. It's something that we've yet to grow beyond and heal with the right kind of medicine. Another thing this has brought us to is that we're living in what could be called a post-truth world, right? I talked a little bit about that in the first lecture of what it means to be in a post-truth world. A quote from McGilchrist, just to highlight it. Once the theoretical mind is untethered from the body and community in which it is grounded and from which it receives its intuitions, there simply is no longer any solid basis for discriminating truth from untruth. So once we get separated from reality, we can't actually establish what's true and what's not true anymore. And that's partly the world that we're living in. So as we look at the modern and postmodern world that we're in now, and we add to all of this increased mobility, extreme change in the pace of life, the fragmentation of social bonds, loss of shared values, the random juxtaposition of information exposure, the intrusion of distant events into our everyday consciousness, increased population density, all of these things lead to a deterioration of our mental health, right, which was the focus of our second lecture. So, and when we think about what would a left hemisphere world look like, quantity would replace quality. We'd see depersonalization, loss of individuality in categories and groups, a paranoia and a lack of trust, a hyper-focus on language and labels, and the juxtaposition of homogenization and control, right? Like leveling everything and making everything sort of the same, and then also trying to control things. And in this context, even our attempts to forge identity end up being sort of off the mark, right? Because we have now in culture an emphasis on identity that is overly attendant to language and labels and categories and sort of generalized ways of thinking about identity. And that just signals our lack of connection to actual embodied individuals, right? And having a sense of like your individual unique self in the context of embodied and tacit relationships with other people that actually form real wholes and real collectives, not abstract ideas of categories of collectives, right? So we're sort of stuck in a world of abstract identity instead of experienced connection to community. So in sum, as we think about, in the first lecture, we talked about this evolution from archaic to magic to mythic to mental. And the mental is where we see the emergence of modernity and also sort of degeneration of the mental in this separation is what we're trying to come to terms with. But then after the mental comes the integral, right? So there is this point to the future of what's possible. We reintegrate the hemispheres. We reintegrate the polarities of our experience. We can heal our experience of the world. We can heal our connection to truth and value, and we can heal our connections to each other. Another touch point for me is a scholar called Hartmut Rosa, who's a German sort of sociologist. and he talks about the uncontrollability of the world and resonance. And this idea of resonance is really important as we try to figure out how to come back into an integrated experience of each other. There's this sort of contrast. Another way of framing the contrast is between resonance with the world versus control of the world, right? And his work is really to point out how resonance is unpredictable. It's non-engineerable. You can't predict it. You can't control it. You can't make it happen. And our incessant desire to make the world controllable and predictable and manageable actually alters our relationship to it and makes it so that we're not in resonance with it anymore. And this drive to control actually creates new forms of sort of monstrous uncontrollability, right? So there's also like a tragic irony there. So the inherent uncontrollability of life eludes us when we confront it with a desire to control it. We lose resonance with it, and this leads to anxiety and despair and frustration. So resonance is a different kind of mode of relation, right? It's characterized by the ability to be affected, by responsiveness. There can be no method, there can be no plan, there can be no guide. We actually have to intuit it and feel it out for ourselves. So we have to be, less like machines and more like water, right? We need maybe to be a little bit less like Elon and a little bit more like Bruce Lee, right? We need to learn how to actually flow. We need to be in resonance with each other in reality. We can't have it scripted. We can't model it. We can't map it. And computers obviously cannot offer resonance with humans. They can only simulate it, right? We're literally in relationship with a simulation when we're in relationship with machines. We need to be in relationship with things that speak with their own voice, right? So when you're in relationship to an actual person, they are independent and you can't control them. They have their own voice, and actually all of nature is like that if we are participating with it. Another aspect to sort of unpack, another important book is called The Blind Spot, which is co-written by a neuroscientist, a biologist, and a physicist. And they're really looking at the sort of world of science and this scientific worldview and how our institutions of science have been taken over by left hemisphere dominant materialism. And the blind spot is basically that we can't see our own consciousness, right? We're always left grappling with trying to understand what is the relationship between subject and object. How can we both be a part of the world and that which is seeing and understanding the world? It's just this fundamental thing that the left hemisphere cannot see or understand. It just can't. It's a blind spot. You have to reorient to sort of open up to different kinds of revelations to get the kind of answers that you want. But science is always an expression of how we experience the world, right? We can't get out of that loop. A scientific narrative is always made from the relationship between the world and our experience of it. There's just no way out of that. There is no view from nowhere or view from everywhere. There is no objective truth outside of our relationship to it. We are in it and of it and figuring it out. And we are experiencing it directly. But we have to sort of accept the sort of relational nature of truth, right? Truth is not a view from nowhere, and it's not just in our head. It's actually a relationship. And it's evolving and changing, but we are a part of that evolution and change. And two aspects of what they call the computational blind spot, which again, and they're not talking at all about the brain, but the connection is really clear. What they're calling the blind spot is substituting computational models for the everyday world, which is part of what dominates science right now, and failing to see how we are led to remake the world so that it fits the limits of our computational systems, right? That's the left hemisphere worldview. That's the scientific blind spot. That's the worldview that actually dominates all of our institutions of science and higher learning right now, which is a pretty big problem. And the sort of meta-crisis, which is overarching sort of all of these lectures, understanding the sum total of all the problems that we're facing, combined with our collective inability to solve them, right? The whole meta-crisis is, in a way, an outgrowth of this imbalance and this sort of orientation toward the world that is rooted in what is a blind spot. So, where do we go from here, right? Where do we go? We have to find a way to obviously transcend this worldview. We have to find a way to reclaim meaning and value. We have to, through an integrated experience of reality that includes both left hemisphere and right hemisphere orientations in relationship with each other, we have to create cultures that can actually see that life enables the disclosure of value, and value gives meaning to life. Value is intrinsic and is disclosed by life. We can't separate truth from values, right? The value of truth depends on value. Like science is a product of human aspiration that can't be explained by science, right? Truth disclosure is the purpose of science. The value of truth is not empirically verifiable, right? There's deeper connections to truth and value that cannot be explained by anything the left hemisphere can ever say or do. Science can't explain science, right? The Newtonian paradigm can never answer why these laws, why these truths, right? Natural selection can never be explained by natural selection. There's always some underlying holistic reality that all of these concepts and models and maps and narratives emerge out of. Einstein said the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. The fact that it is comprehensible is a miracle. At least it should seem that way. And actually, that's how it should seem to the left hemisphere, because it just doesn't make any sense. How can we actually comprehend the world at all? The left hemisphere cannot understand it. But it's true. And the appropriate response to that is it's awe. It's an acknowledgement that actually we can't ever reduce it to anything else or fully understand it, right? When St. Augustine said, one may not enter into truth except by means of love, and when St. Anselm said, I believe in order that I might understand, they weren't saying, oh, I believe in this propositional belief, and therefore now I know the truth. They're talking about belief as not a proposition, but a disposition, right? It's about being open. It's about a trust and a faith and an orientation to actually being open to the disclosure and revelation of truth through reality. And it's only through that kind of orientation that we can actually have reality disclosed to us. Otherwise, we cut it off because we trap ourselves in only sort of one half of what's possible for us. Wendell Berry said the incompleteness of a system is rarely, if ever, perceptible to those who made it or benefit from it. Right? So we can't always listen to those who are in positions of power around these things. They're the ones who are benefiting from these imbalances and the ones who are creating them. And the reality is we are in a world where many people are confused. We have to just face that. They're trapped in a left hemisphere view of the world. They think they are masters of the universe, when in reality they have misinterpreted the emissary's notes. Right? The left hemisphere is disclosing things to them. It does have some truth to give us, but we have to reintegrate it into our right hemisphere sense of wholeness and completeness and fullness. And this brings us to a new understanding of religion and spirituality. And from there, I will eventually talk about education, I promise. Trying not to think too much about time, but just let things unfold. So thank you for bearing with me. Brian McGee said, direct experience which is never adequately communicable in words is the only knowledge we ever really have. I believe that to be true. The only thing we ever actually know is that which we can't fully explain. And this is why we need, in our languages, words that point beyond language, right? It's actually essential. That's why we need some sense of religion and spirituality. Whether you call it Logos, or Li, or Brahman, or God, or Allah, or Yahweh, or the ever-present origin, you need a word that points beyond language. Without those kinds of words, something at the core of our experience actually sort of fades from view, and we start to think it doesn't exist. But with the word, we make the mistake of thinking that we've actually grasped something that can never be grasped, right? So that's the tension there. So we have to be in relationship to that tension. But we need some kind of spirituality or religion to remind us of this broader context, right? To remind us that there is a moral order of value, that we have a network of obligations, and to have a sense of trust, because trust does depend to some extent on shared beliefs, actually. Jürgen Habermas, who's one of the greatest contemporary philosophers, and can be well thought of as sort of the epitome of like modern rational philosophy, toward the end of his life, came to the realization that among modern societies, only those that are able to introduce into the secular domain the essential contents of their religious traditions, which point beyond the merely human realm, will also be able to rescue the substance of the human. So this is sort of, his journey is one where you can see one going to the complete apex and final frontiers of rational thought and ending up in a place where at the end of your life you have to acknowledge, wow, we have to find a way to reintegrate religion. And we can see that, religious fundamentalism and dogma are actually expressions of left hemisphere thinking, right? Characteristics of intolerance, self-righteousness, and a refusal to accept that all positions make assumptions and are open to question. Those are left hemisphere orientations. But so is a kind of militant atheism, right? Whether you're a fundamentalist religious believer or you're a fundamentalist atheist, you're actually manifesting left hemisphere dominant ways of relating to other people and other perceptions. So they're both sort of afflictions, actually, of people who are trapped in the left hemisphere dominant world. And our current secular predicament, combining that orientation with these other things, it's a recipe for unhappiness, right? You remove people from their natural world. You repudiate the continuity of culture. You believe you have a right to do whatever you want. You minimize the role played by common beliefs. You dismantle the social structures and call them sources of oppression. And you reject an idea of a transcendent source of values. Like, that's a recipe for civilizational disaster, which is why we need nature. We need music. We need art. We need meditation. We need ritual. We need shared embodied experiences to bind us together. Again, right? That's actually the root meaning of the word religion, that which binds together. And those are the things that bind us together, and we need to find ways to reclaim them. And to return to Barfield, too, in this sense of final participation, that's what's possible for us, is to go through this potentially apparently necessary phase of loss of participation, of sort of disequilibrium and disintegration, again, in a dialectical sense, in service of reintegration and some sort of final participation. And for Barfield, a key ingredient in final participation is imagination. And here he actually connects to the work of Rudolf Steiner. And for Barfield, Steiner is actually an exemplar of final participation, because when we learn how to use our imagination and our thinking properly and appropriately and in right relationship to our sort of holistic transverbal experience of reality, we're able to experience our representations consciously, right? And conscious participation in the creation of our representations, knowing that they're just representations and not reality. That is one way of understanding what imagination is. And Steiner showed that imagination and the final participation that it leads to involve the whole human, right? There's an integrative orientation there in terms of thought, feeling, will, and character sort of coming together in a holistic orientation to life that I would say now, 100 years later, also has a lot to do with reorienting and reintegrating the hemispheres of the brain. And Barfield warns us that the idols we create, for Barfield, idolatry is actually when we mistake representations for reality. So when we have a representation or a model or an idea or a word, and we think it exists separate from us, we lose our participation with it, that's idolatry, right? And this way of thinking that he's talking about, where we're divorced from participation, it's idolatrous, fundamentally. And this is actually what physics is based on, is the creation of models, and then thinking that those models are reality, as opposed to models of reality. So the idols that we create are the representations that we actually think are real and separate from us. And he warns us that the idols we create are built into the souls of our children, who learn more and more to think of themselves as objects among objects. But for him, the sort of subjective emptiness that we're experiencing collectively, it's a sort of wilderness or lonely place, and it's a call for repentance, but in a way where he describes this moment in time in the modern world as the null point between original and final participation, right? So again, we can see it in a dialectical way, in a hero's journey kind of way, and we have to see what's on the other side. And for him, the scientific revolution will and should be remembered as freeing us from original participation so that we may experience final participation, right? Because there is an added element when we are able to consciously represent things and actually master our minds in a certain way. We're not going back. You can't go back in history. You can't go back in your own evolution. We don't want to become less conscious and less able to control the world, what we want to do is integrate and come to a higher order synthesis. So let's talk a little bit more about value and then how we reconnect to value in education. So just to recap too, in the pre-modern world, value is real. All things are made of gods, and we have this sense of original participation. In the modern world, we have a loss of intimacy, a quantification, loss of the sacred. Attention becomes a commodity, and our attention is degraded. And in the possible future, we have a revaluation, a new sense of participation, and a new recalibration between the relationship between the hemispheres. And here, how we pay attention to the world becomes the key ingredient in how we achieve final participation. And this is why our relationship to technology is so important, because it's having an impact on how we're spending our attention and how we're cultivating our attention. For McGilchrist, the choice we make of how we dispose our consciousness is the ultimate creative act. It renders the world what it is. It is therefore a moral act. It has consequences. Attention is a creative act, and creation is really about the induction of a highly attentive state. What is required is an attentive response to something real and other than ourselves, which comes more and more into being through our response to it. If we are truly responsive to it, we nurture it into being or not. In this, it has something of the structure of love. That's McGilchrist. So, in this age of attentionalism, which is what some people are calling it, we're not just dealing with the capturing of our attention, we're dealing with, again, what could be thought of as techno-feudalism, where we're actually embedded in systems of computation and surveillance that are tracking our attention over time and finding patterns so that they can ever improve their ability to model our behavior and manipulate us. That's techno-feudalism, and it's the world, it's the left-hand path, it's the left hemisphere path. So it's time we reorient ourselves to how important our attention is, right? And we might have to get to the point where we think of attention as a right. We have a right to our attention. It forms our identity. It's the way to our own interior reality. I have a right to not have my personhood violated through the manipulation of my attention. This is why we have to protect our children's attention. I also have a responsibility to protect and nurture my attention. The capacity to place inward attention is the capacity to discern value, right? We have to see the intrinsic value of things in the world through our capacity to cultivate our attention on those supposed things. And it's the way we align desire, need, value, and meaning. All these things come together in how we spend our attention. Human socialization throughout history, one of the things that's interesting, you can look at the work of somebody like Michael Tomasello, who looks at sort of the evolution of humanity, the differences between humans and apes and chimps and monkeys. One of the things that characterizes humans is our capacity for shared attention, right? Culture grows through shared attention. And the deepening of the intimacy between people and our ability to share attention together is what enables the evolution of culture. So we have to rebuild our capacity for long duration joint attention, which we're kind of modeling right now if you're actually still with me and tracking me. This is a shared attentional space. It's actually evolutionarily productive to cultivate one's attention to the point where they can actually listen to someone talk for over an hour. A lot of people can't do that anymore, apparently. It's a lost art. Let's make lectures great again or something. We need to find a way to sort of have this kind of shared attention. And, if we think about the evolutionary stack of, it's beautiful to really think about, the plant attends to the sun, right? Like the predator attends to the prey. The child attends to the parent. There's an evolution of attention. And the capacity that we have for shared attention is actually, it's the key ingredient. It's actually the main thing that we have to focus on because it's moment by moment. It's qualitative, not quantitative. So we have to learn how to value attention because attention is what enables us to disclose inherent and implicit and true and real value. So the work of McGilchrist touches on this, and also the work of my friend Zach Stein and the people at the Center for World Philosophy and Religion. They're sort of unpacking some of this and really homing in on how the perception of intrinsic value is a human capacity that has to be cultivated, right? Just as our nervous system has evolved to perceive space and time, it has also evolved to perceive value. If you look at developmental psychologists like Piaget, Kohlberg, and Fowler, you can see there is a sort of universal process where we become more in alignment with morals and values. There is a sort of universal evolutionary process that we can be a part of where we become more and more in touch with what's real and true and moral and good and valuable. We can think of the eye of the senses as being trained and needing to be trained, and skills we have to develop. We can call that science. But we also have this eye of value that also has to be refined and clarified and trained, and we could call that philosophy or religion or something else. But if we sort of replace philosophy and religion with science, we're not cultivating the skill of valueception, right? Of how to perceive actual value in the world. Valueception is not always correct, but it's always present, right? Clear and correct perceiving of value is an art and a skill that comes with experience, just like everything else, pretty much. Anything that would go with the physical world also requires experience and the development of skill, and some people are more perceptive than others. But civilization depends upon access to sacred values at the center of culture, is also part of the argument. Not just as doctrine and rhetoric, but as rituals and stories that bind us together to each other and our world. So erasing the sacred, which is another aspect of modernity we have to come to terms with, erasing the sacred from the center of culture removes the basis of social legitimacy and authority within a civilization, and that it inevitably leads to moral and institutional decay. The distortion of values leads to civilization being driven toward ends that are actually irrational, with outcomes that people don't actually want, right? And we can see this in society today. Things are happening that nobody actually wants because we're not in touch with what is true and valuable, and we don't have shared stories that clarify that for each other. So what we're in need of right now, and what our education should be oriented toward, is a sort of transvaluation in civilization. That's ultimately what we need to do. And the good news is, it won't be the first time. We've actually seen this happen before. So when we think of the axial age, when we see the emergence of agriculture and monotheism, we see a huge shift in civilizational sense-making and orientation to reality and orientation to what's true and real and valuable. We see it again in the secular age, right? And the emergence of industry and capitalism and the sort of loss of connection to intrinsic value and a sort of civilization scale like revaluation of how we even think about each other and about values. And it seems to be that we're coming upon a precipice where some other shift of a similar scale might be necessary, right? Some people are thinking of this as the meta-modern age or the integral age. And we can see, just like agriculture led to monotheism and industry led to the secular age, now we're in this global planetary age of digital technology. And what we need is a worldview, a religious, spiritual worldview that actually is appropriate to that world, right? My friend John Churchill calls this planetary dharma, right? We need some sense of planetary dharma. We actually, and also my friends at the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, there's a lot of people who are, once you start to tune into this evolutionary arc, you start to sense that we need some planetary religion. We need something that's going to actually bind us all together. We need a shared story that's actually grounded in a shared sense of value. Like it seems to be an omega point of sorts. People like Aurobindo, Teilhard de Chardin, Whitehead, there's a lot of people who have been intuiting this for a while, and apparently things take time, but it doesn't mean that's not still where we're going. So let's finish by talking about education. I'm sorry this has gone on so long. But the punchline again is there are ways of educating our children and creating educational communities that actually account for everything that I've said and talk about. That's the gist, is like, okay, if all of that is anything close to true, how then should we educate our children? How then should we create educational communities with each other? The foundation of our experience in sacred value is established in early childhood. Our innate needs and desires being met is what enables trust and openness and participation in life, right? If you want to look at original participation, look at a young child who has secure attachment and is well loved. It is fully present right there. You don't have to go back in time. It's still with us. The valueception that is enabled by that kind of care, which we then, when we are well cared for, we internalize that into our own sense of self and identity in a healthy way. That kind of valueception depends on an integrated brain. So we have to always be thinking about what are the practices and behaviors and cultures that enable and facilitate a well-integrated and balanced experience through the brain, right? 99% of what our brains register never enters conscious awareness. Learning depends on tacit knowledge, right? What Michael Poliani called tacit knowledge. We always know more than we can tell, right? There's a lot going on in the apparently simple play-based environments where healthy adults and healthy children are relating well to each other. As Eugene Gendlin said, we think more than we can say, we feel more than we can think, we live more than we can feel, and there is much else besides, right? So when you're in an educational environment, you should be tuned into not just what is said, not just the words on the walls, the feeling, the living quality. It's also worth noting, when we think about the aims of education, we think about really high-functioning people, self-actualized people, the kinds of people we want to cultivate in the world. Studies of experts, like people like Hubert Dreyfus is sort of an expert on studying experts. One of the patterns you see here is experts and people who are very tuned in and successful. They rely on pattern recognition, common sense understanding, a sense of salience and intuition, very limited deliberative rationality, right? They do not depend on calculative rationality or procedure. Experts now in our world are sort of an endangered species, right? The increasingly bureaucratic society that we're living in is making, it's endangering skill and expertise through over-reliance on rationality and procedure and rules. Another thing to acknowledge here that's relevant to education is the primacy of affect, right? I sort of said at the beginning, you can't actually separate emotion and rationality. That's not a left hemisphere separation. Affect and emotion are always present in our thinking. Nietzsche, again, was actually ahead of us on this one. Nietzsche said, thoughts are the shadows of our feelings, right? It's the feelings that are actually primary. So we have to, again, it's just a way of orienting us toward paying attention to the feeling quality of our educational environments and not just what is didactically and explicitly said. So when we think about educational culture, we can think of it in terms of, is it resonant or is it reductive, right? And a quantitative focus on certain measures tends to preclude all of these qualitative things from our awareness, right? We create models of educational value and success that are divorced from our experiential reality. And the demand for measured accountability increases as trust decreases, right? So we need to have cultures of high trust so that we don't have to depend on bureaucratic control of people. And this is something I come back to a lot as the leader of a school. When you have to go through things like accreditation and you have to sort of answer for why you do what you do, there's this strong tendency to formalize, to standardize, to put it in words, to have rubrics and models, and to sort of reduce it all to what's written. And it's so viscerally almost violent to me to have to do that, because the experience of the quality of an educational institution is in the lived relationships, and you can't put it on a spreadsheet or a document. You just cannot. So we need to be aware of that. Another thing I'll say is the importance of play is relevant here, right? The desire to play is, I think, fundamentally the desire to evolve through a whole-brained and embodied experience of reality in a way that's resonant, that's in resonant relationship to the truth of life. That is what play actually is. So it'd be nice if we could appreciate that when we're just having a play-based early childhood environment. For Hartmut Rosa, he also talks about this tension between education and controllability, right? You can't control kids. You can't control education. It's semi-controllable at best. And education occurs not when a particular skill has been acquired. It occurs when a socially relevant segment of the world begins to speak to us, right? When we begin to see, oh my God, history, physics, music, and it's something to say to me, and I can be in relationship with it in a self-efficacious way. That's learning, right? It's not just information or even skill development. And it's a process of transformation where people learn to speak with their own voice, right? And you can't control that voice. So you have to embrace the nebulous, messy nature of it. You can't standardize it. You can't control it. You can't limit the child's right hemisphere experience to your left hemisphere world of representation. So be aware of that as an educator and as a parent. So the genius of Waldorf education is that its intentions and its foundations actually do include a deep understanding and intuition of the significance of human experience and the development in the historical context that I've been talking about. Like, my sense is that everything that I've said today is actually in some form included in the intuitive impulse of Waldorf education. What we can add to it and what we can flesh out is, things like understanding the hemispheric brain and how that actually can develop our understanding and appreciation for things like Waldorf education, but it's actually completely resonant with it. And the intention of Waldorf education is to give an introduction to the foundation of society while also enhancing the child's ability to accurately perceive life around them without damaging their innate capacity to be sensitively aware of the creative love that's behind the visible world. Right? That's one way of describing what Waldorf education is actually trying to do. And Steiner's ideas about education are explicitly not a rigid theory about what to do. It's not a script. Right? That's why he emphasizes the art of teaching, because you can't control it, you can't script it, you can't tell people exactly what to do. It's something that it's an impulse that has to be adapted to specific conditions. And Steiner was very aware of the dysfunctions and the limits of the modern mind. I mean, that's what makes it so prescient and relevant today, is he said that humanity has arrived at a place of misery because it made itself dependent on what he called the kind of thinking and feeling peculiar to the West. He saw really clearly this Western, modern, out of participation, left hemisphere orientation to the world was fundamentally misguided and off. And we have to strengthen ourselves from within to balance the damaging forces of those kinds of environments. In Western education, outside of Waldorf, we see psychology and education in the modern world have been dominated by materialism, behaviorism, and determinism, right? The APA, the American Psychological Association, is not a fountain of wisdom. It's not. It's a captured institution by left hemisphere materialistic, behavioristic thinking. We have to be able to see that and respond to those kinds of expertise accordingly. And modern schools are actually in some ways interfering with the evolution of cognition by bringing intellectuality too soon, right? So we can also appreciate the slow approach of education. By bringing a left hemisphere orientation to children too soon, we're sort of pulling them out of their original participation too early, and then it's even more lost. It's even harder to recapture if we don't maintain a thread of it as they go through the necessary balancing of their brains, as their hemispheres begin to differentiate more. You want to make it so that they never really fully lose touch with their right hemisphere participation. You can add the abstraction and the models and the concepts without ever losing touch with your connection to nature and music and reality as a whole. In Waldorf education, it's well understood that the materialism of the modern world is dysfunctional and inhumane. It's understood that humanity grows through periods of sensitivity and capacity, and that timing is very important, right? Grass does not grow faster by pulling on it. And that environment is very important, right? How we foster the right relationship between people and their environment is key. And environments have a big impact on people. So it's about bringing a different sort of artfulness and sensitivity to that. Another thing that's key in Waldorf education is that nothing is more important than seeing that history represents the evolution of consciousness, and we actually teach this somewhat explicitly, right? We have high school courses that go through the evolution of consciousness through art and poetry and music and architecture. It's actually at the foundation of what we're doing. And when we start to teach history in 5th grade, it's rooted in intuitive conceptions of the past, right? Which enables us to not be so imprisoned by the limitation of more contemporary ways of thinking. Another beautiful thing to point out about Waldorf education is it has a dialectical component to it as well that actually mirrors the dialectical process that our brains go through. It starts with immediacy of experience, which is actually a right hemisphere orientation. It then goes through a ripening of that experience through art, and then the crystallization of concepts, right? So there's experience, art, and then concept. So you have to go, there's an order to things, there's a flow to things, there's a relationship between different sequences in a learning process. So again, it's to put it simply too, we can see very clearly music, art, nature, craft, handwriting, gardening, building, right? Head, heart, hands, right? It's holistic, it's integrated. And when we talk about head, heart, hands, we're talking about whole body, whole brain, whole spirit, right? It's all in a sense of not fragmented, not fractured, but holistic and integral. I'm going to end with a quote by John Gardner. "Only a whole intelligence, maturing from complete experience, well-centered and in harmony with itself, can actually do what it sets out to do. Only such an intelligence can so master the extreme paradoxicality of modern life as to achieve real peace and real health. An intelligence that matures from experience, that shares in the life of things, that is creative and practical, fulfills itself. It finds satisfaction in properly human pursuits. Waldorf schools aim to develop this kind of intelligence, for in it they see the only prospect for freedom and fulfillment in the world." Apologies again for the length of the lecture, but I think I'll stop there. And if you have any energy for it, I'd love to hear some questions.
So many wonderful threads in what you presented today. My mind unconsciously raced to the distinction I've seen sometimes in the Gurdjieff work and in other places, the distinction between, or the relationship between essence and personality. A personality that is very developed in a primitive person, but where there is no left brain function to use. It's very noble, it's very well adapted to its environment, but the developmental prospect is not there in terms of changing the externals of life. If too much in the left brain is exactly what you've described. It has no relationship with anything, any greater reality, either psychologically or spiritually. Does that?
Yeah, it resonates. I don't have much to add to that. I have some friends who have studied Gurdjieff, but I haven't really, if that's sort of a part of what you're referring to. But one thing I'll just say, pattern recognition and intuitive acknowledgement of deep resonance between different frameworks that are all pointing to the same thing is a really important thing to experience and perceive, in the sense of whether it's Gurdjieff or Aurobindo or McGilchrist or Barfield or Steiner. And this is the sense of truth is a relationship. We're all, there is an elephant and we are all groping from different sides. And even if Gurdjieff's feeling the tail and Steiner's feeling the ear and Barfield's feeling the side, there's an elephant, right? There is a reality and they're all perceiving it directly and truly. So there's so many different angles at which we can come at these things. Yeah. And the significance of the hemispheric, which is why McGilchrist's work has just blown me away so much, is that because it's so foundational, this just fundamental pattern of asymmetry, it connects to so many different things. So there's almost a countless number of examples or different people's insights where you could say, oh, this connects to this in this way. So to me, that it's just a good sign, and it's how we know we're on the right path of sort of perceiving something that's really foundational and important. Yeah.
All right. You mentioned the captured institutions, certainly probably all of them, a lot of them. I'd be curious. I have a lot of friends really all over the world that are related to Waldorf schools, and mileage varies in terms of how much, let's say, how much Steiner, how much life is actually part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be curious as to anyone's sense of is the knowledge system informing Waldorf schools to the extent to which you think that might be
Yeah.
the case.
Yeah. Fair question. I would say that Waldorf schools are not immune or impervious to being captured by left hemisphere dominant orientations or being captured by other more contemporary sort of cultural movements or mimetic influences. So there's definitely ways in which Waldorf schools have lost their clarity and sense of mission. And I would say that the way that I am unfolding things and explaining things here, I get the sense that there are many people in the Waldorf movement who really resonate with it and appreciate it, but it's not common yet in Waldorf schools for such connections to be being made clearly and explicitly. But that is as would be expected. Does that make sense? Any follow-up? Poke the bear a little bit more?
I'd say it would be, I think your efforts to have these conversations is really what gives this life. I certainly appreciate it.
Thank you. How else would you do it? I don't know. We have to speak it. We have to try to bring these things together in a coherent, comprehensive way, in a way that can be understood by other people, in a sort of beautiful, ironic move to sort of help use language and ideas and concepts and imagination to shake people out of their left hemisphere dominant sort of default mode. Yeah, thank you. I think it has to happen. It's happening. It will happen. It's all happening. It's all coming together.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. As a philosopher with a background in phenomenology, I could appreciate a lot of what you're saying about the left and right hemisphere, and the discussion of Nietzsche and all. I think I completely agree with the overall arguments, but maybe a couple of things that I would have loved to hear more about is just this idea of direct experience of reality, which I take it to be art has that. It's not direct. It just goes beyond our conceptual understanding of the world as Kant said. And I think you painted Kant as more rationalist, but he's also wrote a critique of judgment, which is all about art and how art goes beyond our understanding, and therein lies the experience of sublime, right? Because we cannot fathom it, and that's good that we cannot fathom it. It shows that the world is not completely the left dominant, right? It goes beyond that. So I don't know how you are using the word of direct experience of reality. I'd love to hear more about that. Is it simply the experience of nature where we are constantly reminded of the lack of models to completely comprehend it? Is that what Waldorf emphasizes, what this school emphasizes? Is that what you take it as the direct experience of reality?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It won't be an easy one to answer. Maybe we can have a longer conversation sometime. Yeah, my focus in graduate school was Husserl and Heidegger and Whitehead, mostly,
Heidegger
and some
Ponte.
yeah. But there's things that people like Husserl and Whitehead were trying to do and explain, like for instance, the idea of misplaced concreteness, the idea of the sort of epoche of consciousness, like how do you get out of the model? So they were working in that direction, but I think when people working in that direction at the limits of thought and trying to understand that sort of boundary between model and reality, concept and percept, is there an unmediatedness? How do you reckon with the fact that there doesn't seem to be any way out of the left hemisphere sort of way of thinking ultimately? I think where we're led to in those kinds of trajectories of thought and understanding are different forms of mysticism and spirituality. And what helped me a lot is actually a deep dive into integral theory and the work of Ken Wilber, because what he does is he takes basically the history of philosophy and thought and tries to integrate it with understanding developmental psychology and also the developmental maps of spiritual awakening of different religious traditions. So there's a sort of perennial philosophy that people like Aldous Huxley tried to understand, where there's this unity of religions and this unity of religious experience. And then there's a history of ideas, and there's developmental psychology, and how do all those things fit together. And what integral theory does is try to work all those things together through sort of orienting generalizations that enable us to understand different state stages. So there's all different kinds of stages of consciousness. There's the structures of consciousness that people like Gebser talk about: archaic, magic, mythic, mental, integral. But what Wilber and others point, there's also state stages that have to do with stages of awakening, basically. So it becomes a spiritual and religious conversation in terms of how do we understand what is enlightenment. And different traditions have different ways of nuancing that, but even traditions themselves have their own evolutions. Like my background is mostly in Buddhism in terms of religion, so understanding the evolution of the three turning of the wheels in Buddhism, right, from Hinayana to Mahayana to Vajrayana, the insights that are available to one in a sort of Vajrayana world or tantric experience of reality. I think you have to go to places like that to really answer your question.
Well, thank you. Can I can ask a follow-up or a separate question, actually? I think you're right in kind of assessing the situation as this fragmentary experience of reality, and I think media has a lot to do with it, to where algorithms present different sets of videos and posts to different people, and we do not have that shared reality, let alone shared values. And I think this is a very difficult kind of task for educators, where we're dealing with students, and I'm one myself, who come from very different experiences of reality. I don't know how Waldorf kind of tries to tackle this with such this kind of fragmented sense of what the world is, the different media that we consume, and we come together maybe for some time. But I don't know how does one go to that ideal that you posed, like this kind of
Yeah. Well, I think it's a long road, and we're not trying to get children to, like full bodhisattvic enlightenment by the time they graduate high school. So it's simple. But the genius of Waldorf that I'm trying to point to is just in the simplicity of the things that we do, in the tacit and implicit intelligence of the things that we do. Everything that I've said and infinitely more is actually it's implicate in that. So that there's an unfathomable depth in the simplicity of ritual and play and music and song. So we practice rituals and play and music and song. But hardly anyone is experiencing the fullness of the meaning of that in the moment. But we do it anyway. And hopefully, over time, people will deepen their understanding and appreciation of what's happening.
The way you began with having to understand the world in order to bring the correct medicine comes to mind. If there was an understanding, you used the word genius, or I thought it was, I hadn't heard that Owen Barfield said that Rudolf Steiner was an exemplar of this future consciousness, but that's certainly been my experience. And therefore the medicine, we don't always understand as patients what the doctor understands, but we're grateful to be healed by the medicine. And so I feel there's something of that dynamic there.
Yeah, you can't always understand why or how a medicine works. And there might be factors involved in whether or not it works that we don't fully understand, that are contingent in ways that we can't understand. There's so many factors involved, and there's so little we can understand. But we work on what we can, and I feel like there's I don't have more to add. I think that's true. Anna, do you have something? Yeah.
It's not exactly a question, but more of like a follow-up to some of the other comments. I was gonna, to Brian, you were asking about how Waldorf schools are and where they're at, and I think one of the things that I and it's not just Steiner.
Mm-hmm.
As we know.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just one comment. And the other thing that I wanted to just point to, and maybe it's like really simplifying it, but just sort of to answer your question and my experience as a teacher and as a parent, where Waldorf education gives these experiences of reality, and it's not that it's just experiences of reality, it's that they are whole experiences of reality. And I think that's where we help children grow to foster a love of wholeness and not getting pulled into this fragmentation. Whereas like even in, if we go into nursery or kindergarten, the children are having whole experiences where they are fully participating in their day. They are grinding grain into flour and then making that flour into bread and then baking that bread and then eating that bread. So they're having these whole sensory experiences through and through, and they're fully also participating in themselves with others, in relationship with others. So this shared attention is also there, and I feel like that continues on through the grades. Now I have a senior who I've gone on field trips with her, and I experienced the same thing where the students are getting these whole shared experiences together, and then it can become art, and then it can become concept. So for me, maybe that's like simplifying it a lot, but just like kind of to directly say how I see Waldorf education is meeting that fragmentation sort of tendency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and the theme that's coming up here in this conversation is, the gap between the direct embodied experience of children and the understanding of adults who are trying to interpret and appreciate or not what's happening and critique what's happening and question what's happening. And that's basically our main challenges, and why I feel like talking about these things is so important. We need to help adults and parents understand the gravity and the depth and the significance of what is apparently so simple. It's hard to wrap your heads around the significance of simple things.
This is maybe just a suggestion, but sort of riffing on this idea that Waldorf education is the medicine. What's the half-life, right? We take our child out of this wonderful environment, giving this medicine, and into our world that is already defined, already very left hemisphere controlled. I mean, no matter what career you're in, we're on computers and cell phones. And how do we integrate? How do we communicate as parents and adults? And I think I'm just posing that. I don't have the answer, but that would help us support what our children do here, and then maybe bring more community in, right? And say there isn't a rejection to what we're doing and how we're defining success in the adult world. We're trying to give more medicine and then extend that medicine, right? And I haven't been able to find that. I haven't been able to articulate that. I've lived in this community for a very long time and known a lot of people who have gone here and done wonderful things. And so I know it's healing, right? But I haven't been able to make the leap to articulate how we take it out of here and continue to live it without making people feel excluded. And that, I think, is something I'd like to learn more about. So that's just feedback and perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it sounds, what I heard was a clear description of the work that you and I and we all have to do. It is what there is to do, is cultivating, following through with the implications of what I'm trying to talk about. Like, if this is true, if this world picture is true, if the story is generally true, if the significance of certain approaches to raising children and educating people is generally true, what are the implications of that for how we live our lives? Is really all you're pointing to. So it's just, that's the work, and there is no answer. That's the thing. There's no script. There's no rules. There's no guidebook, and there cannot be and won't ever be. We have to do the work and figure it out and try to each of us as individuals deepen our understanding of truths and values as much as we can, and have our lives be an expression of that in a way that touches everything that we do, and that touches our home and our children's experience and everything, and just let the ripples spread as they can. I don't know what else to do. Yeah.
It sounds almost as though we're trying to create an internal compass in the children, so that they will always be able to find true north or whatever
Yeah.
or at least go in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard, because one other thing that can happen with Waldorf education, as I have seen as a Waldorf uncle twice over, and that is they don't know how rotten the world can be and how rotten and short-sighted people can be once they leave this loving community. I think some people have a more built-in skepticism perhaps when they come to Waldorf school, and it's not so hard on them, but if you come from a loving family, you go to a loving school, and then you go out into the world and maybe you fall in love with someone who's dysfunctional, as my niece and nephew each did, it becomes very difficult.
Yeah, no, thanks for saying that. That was the other part of what I would have said in response to her, is like the best, I get this question a lot and I don't fully understand it, the question of like, well, it's all great if we can create good conditions here, but what about when they go out in the world? And it's a question that answers itself. Like we're trying to prepare them for the world by giving them a strong foundation, right? And giving them that compass. That is the best preparation for the world. You know, the best preparation for how to use technology is a childhood not using technology. That really is true. Like that's the way you best prepare them, so that they're grounded in the real world. That way they can relate to technology appropriately when they're older.
As a servant, rather.
The opposite would be to early exposure to technology would make it so that they can't or are less likely to be able to have a right relationship with technology later, because they'll have lost that compass and that grounding and that sense of embodiedness. So to me, the answers to some of those things are really clear and simple, and it's just hard. It's so hard for people to just sort of accept the fullness of the task, I think, that's facing us, which is that, like, yes, it's overwhelming to be living in the world that we're living in, and no, it's not going to conform to our sense of like what should be happening, but we just have to continue to try our best. Thank you all for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful Saturday afternoon.
Thank you.
I have 100 questions, but I can't articulate.
That's okay. I feel them.
Will this be available?
Yeah, it'll be available on YouTube and